Hello, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. This is episode 52, which means it's officially been a year since we first launched this series. So we just wanted to thank you for your support, your views and comments, your donations, and of course, your questions. And here's to another year of it. So our first question of episode 52 is from Marty from Florida, who says, I have APOE4. Does that mean I will develop Alzheimer's? I'm almost 70 now, working and physically fit female, vegan except for weekly salmon.
Well, just to start off with a grim topic, Marty, I am sorry to hear you were dealing with that. But I think that overall, there's lots of room for optimism. Okay, we have spent a lot of time covering Alzheimer's. People will recall, perhaps, there's two types. There's early onset, it gets you in your 50s, it's familial, it's due to a gene, it's due to a mutation. If one of your parents had it, you've got approximately a 50% chance. What we're talking about now is the other kind, late onset, non-familial, sporadic, where it's not caused by a mutation. And the amazing news that comes out of that literature is about 50% of your risk for late onset Alzheimer's is due to lifestyle risk factors, which blew everyone away, and a life where you're having more antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and exercise and stimulation and all those things that mainstream medicine would consider to be way too squishy to pay attention to, nonetheless accounts for 50% of the risk. Wow, that's great. But nonetheless, lurking in the background, there still is a role for genes, not genes, mutations causing Alzheimer's with 100% certainty, instead, genes modulating your risk. And the grandmother of all genes that modulates Alzheimer's risk is called ApoE, apolipoprotein E. ApoE, it comes in three flavors, ApoE2, 3, and 4. I don't know what happened to E1 if it got discontinued or something, but E2, 3, 4. And the key thing is that depending on which one you have, your chances of late onset Alzheimer's are modulated. And this is a powerful modulation. Luck out and get two copies of E2, jargon in the business, be homozygotic for E2, and you've got maybe a 15% chance of getting Alzheimer's. E3, somewhere in between. And at the other extreme, be homozygotic, which is to say you have two copies of the E4 gene, have two copies of that, and depending on the study, depending on the ethnic makeup of the population, very roughly for European populations, somewhere in the range of 60 to 80% likelihood of getting late onset Alzheimer's. Bad, scary, all of that. So the day that was announced, and that was front page news, every neuroscientist on earth said, apolipoprotein E, what is that? And people soon found out it is a lipid transporter in the bloodstream. And thus, all the neuroscientists turned to all the lipid experts, and all of them said, apolipoprotein E, what is that? It was totally obscure. But it turns out it comes in three different versions, and it transports lipids, fatty acids, cholesterol, things like that in the bloodstream. So immediately, the crazed question that dominated the field, like you cannot believe, is what does ApoE have to do with the nuts and bolts of Alzheimer's? And how is E2, E3, and E4 working differently, where E2 is what you want and E4 is what you don't want? And lots of you will recall perhaps a lot of what Alzheimer's revolves around are these two bits in neuropathology. You form what are called amyloid plaques, CRUD, and you form what are called neurofibrillary tangles, illustrated by using my other hand. So you got plaques and tangles, and all anybody wanted to study at that point is how does ApoE interact with plaques or interact with neurofibrillary tangles with the additional stringency where E2 would interact in a good way, E3 in a neutral way, E4 in a terrible way. Everybody went looking because this was the wedge. This was going to break open our understanding of Alzheimer's. And what people began to figure out was basically they were looking in the wrong place for specific interactions between ApoE and amyloid plaques or neurofibrillary tangles or the nuts and bolts of Alzheimer's itself. Because people began to figure out that's interesting. Your ApoE status modulates your risk of Parkinson's disease. Once again, E2, good news, E4, bad news. Your risk of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, your risk of cognitive impairments after a traumatic brain injury, your risks of boxer's dementia, dementia pugilistica. Everybody, way too slowly, in my opinion, got around to saying, we shouldn't be looking at the specifics of amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. ApoE status has something to do very generically with how resilient your brain is in the face of any way in which you could kick your brain in its ass by some sort of challenge. E2 augurs well, E4 bad predictor of outcome. And even stuff like IQ and even stuff like how likely you were to get an ICU and intensive care unit psychosis and something ApoE generically, how well your brain deals with challenges. And what was interesting is E4 turns out to be the ancestral version of ApoE. We and all the other primates have E4. It's only a subset of humans, a fairly recent 20, 40, 100,000 years ago that E2 and E3 have evolved. You look at that, and often what you say, E4, well, why doesn't everyone have E2 by now? It seems to be so advantageous. And you see one of these features of a lot of genetic risk factors for disease, which is early on in life, they carry an advantage, something called negative pleiotropy, antagonistic pleiotropy. You get an advantage early in life, and then the bill comes later. And as long as the advantage is big enough early in life, you will maintain that gene risk factor in the population in the long run. What's the hidden early life blessing of ApoE4? It looks as if early in life, it increases fertility in females. It boosts up progesterone levels. It also seems to have something to do with having antimicrobial actions. So your standard issue ancient primate E4, you get some fertility advantages early in life, but then you got anywhere from a 60 to 80% chance of having late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so that's the Mr. Professor version of how it's working and all of that. What about what this translates into for someone like Marty who has the ApoE4? You didn't note if you have the homozygotic version or the heterozygotic, but in either case, you are in the range statistically where you are more likely than not to get late Alzheimer's disease. Freak out, terrible news. Let's deconstruct that a bit. More likely than not, less likely than certain, 60 to 80% certainty, which turfs us back into that realm of about 50% of your risk factors for Alzheimer's, late onset Alzheimer's, are lifestyle interventions. And that's where all the things you could be doing come in. And it sounds like you're doing a lot of them. You're exercising, you're physically active, you're fit, you're healthy, you're not having adult onset diabetes, you're taking antioxidants, perhaps by way of vegetables mostly, perhaps a history of taking anti-inflammatories. We know you're already taking one of the good things, which is omega-3 oils by way of fish. Perhaps you have lucked out and you don't have a history of major depression. That's another piece of good news. Perhaps you have social support. Most importantly, I would say from the literature, you were intellectually stimulated. And I dare say that's exactly what's happening if you're listening to something like this. Okay, so overall, you got a lot going for you in the direction of saying 60 to 80% range. You probably fit the profile of people who nonetheless will not be getting late onset Alzheimer's. Okay, so that's sort of analyzing the scientific risk aspects and the what you could be doing on a daily basis. Let's analyze this psychologically. 60 to 80% risk. And this is where, rather than in a hard-assed realm of neurology, this is where we get into the psychological realm of what do we do with probabilities? Now, in the late 80s, early 90s, the first gene that caused a neurological disease was isolated. This was the gene for Huntington's disease. One of your parents got Huntington's, you had a 50% chance. And if you had that mutation, if you lived long enough, you were going to get Huntington's disease. And that was a huge bioethics challenge to the field. Should people be allowed to get tested? Because you're 20, you're watching your parent die of this unspeakable disease. And as a 20-year-old, you perhaps find out, yes, this is your destiny. Should we let people find out? Are they going to commit suicide, collapse into major depression left and right? Massive medical ethics issue. And what that field is mostly shown is most people who, because of familial Huntington's, are at a 50% risk. Most people don't choose to find out. And of those who do find out and find out bad news, most of them are not throwing themselves off of buildings the next day. So that's the genetics of yes, you are going to get the disease or not. What we got here is probability, vulnerability, risk in different environments, risk with different lifestyles. What do you do with 60 to 80%? And this is where there's a whole science that comes in showing humans do really distortive things with probability. 60 to 80% more likely than not. 60 to 80%, way different from 100%. And there's social psychology studies and there's neurobiology showing that our brain does very distortive stuff with something in the 60 to 80% risk range. Wonderful work by this guy named Earl Miller at MIT using non-human primates, where monkeys, where you were recording from neurons in the cortex and showing circumstances, 100% likelihood of a certain stimulus, 0%, 50%, 75, 25, and so on. And what the study showed is by the time you're getting to about the 60% range, you get this distortion. In the mind of a primate, including us, 60 and 100 are about the same. 60 versus 40 is viewed as way different in terms of neurons responding than 60 versus 40. That's only a difference of 20. I say, flashing my math skills, 60 versus 100, that's a difference of 40. That's twice the difference. But what you see is as soon as we primates with our psyches, as soon as we primates with cortical neurons that have categorical responses, as soon as we get into the range of more likely than not, 60, 80 starts seeming a whole lot more like 100% than less than 50%. So it's in that context that, keep in mind, it sounds like you got all of the lifestyle factors going to your advantage. You were 70, and typically you would have already been seeing signs of Alzheimer's beginning to creep in. And finally, 60 to 80% has as much in common with 40%, you're not likely to get the disease, as with 100%, you're guaranteed to get it. So within that framework, lots of room for optimism.
Okay, next, Johnny from England says, why does following fashion become a thing? Is there any evidence of this happening in the animal world, i.e., groups following trends in behavior?
Oh, there is such a terrific example of that. This was a 2014 paper in the journal Animal Cognition, which I'm sure is on everybody's nightstands. And this was a study of a population of chimpanzees in Zambia. And get a load of this. There was one female in the group, female who, for some reason, lost to even the most ardent of historians trying to make sense of what was going on in 2014 with this chimp, somehow got it in her head that every morning she liked to take a big blade of grass and put it in her ear so it would stick out there all day. It served no obvious function. The paper's great. It's got pictures of her carrying out what they very scientifically called grass blade in ear behavior. She had this thing sticking out. She liked it. Go sue me. I don't know. She liked doing this, whatever. This was a personal quirk. And what was most interesting about this was over the subsequent period of time, other chimps started to do the same thing. And you get these pictures. There's a bunch of chimps sitting around grooming, and they've all got this stupid fashion thing going on there. So, yeah, other species do this. Probably the best way of thinking about it is to make this a little bit larger. Not only why do we primates, we social beings, why do we fall for fashions, but more broadly, why do we fall for conformity? Why do we conform? And the answer to that, I think, is found in all sorts of different cultures that have proverbs to the effect of, the tallest blade of wheat is the first one that gets cut down. Don't stand out. That makes you vulnerable. That makes you different. A story which this is from 40 years ago, and it was told to me at the time as being for real. And it may have been apocryphal, but at the time, something going on with researchers down in the Serengeti on the Tanzanian side of my game park, researchers at the Serengeti Research Institute. There were a group of people who were studying zebras, and I don't know about you, but to me at least, most zebras look kind of similar. And to these folks, they look kind of similar. If you look at the stripe pattern very carefully, each one is individualistic, but that takes a lot of work. So, what they did was these researcher cowboys got a vehicle and they would drive past some zebra who was running, and they would take out this pole with a paintbrush at the end of it and splatter some paint on the zebra's haunch, which inevitably would be a distinctive pattern. Now we know how to recognize this zebra forever after, and that's great, an individual marking now. Except as the story went and was presented as a real fact with high reliability, that night, the next night, that zebra would be killed by hyenas. It wasn't sick. It wasn't injured. There wasn't anything different about it other than it looked way different from all the other zebras. Ooh, bummer of a paint splotch on your rear end there. And what that showed you was something about being nonconformist in that realm was a risk factor among these zebras. Now, we all know the human equivalent, which is the well-known fact that if you are remotely different from anybody else when you were a teenager, you are going to be predated, and there's an interesting paradox going on there. Teenagers want to be exactly like everyone else, except they want to be better at being exactly like everybody else. They want to be the best conformist out there, which is a very thin line to tread there. But the question is, do you see conformity like that in other species? And this was another wonderful study, 2007, from Franz de Waal with chimps, captive chimp population. And here's what he did. He had two groups of chimps. He took the alpha female out of each of these groups and put them in a room there, each one in their own room. And he had this big acrylic puzzle box where you could pull out levers and push this in order to get at some fantastic treat down at the bottom of the puzzle box. And the critical thing was there were two different ways of doing it, two different solutions. They were equally difficult in terms of the number of moves. And, one of the chimps turned out to master doing it this way, and the other chimp did it the other way. Great. So they're now acrylic box masters. and put them back in their social groups and put the puzzle box in there. And everyone's saying, oh my God, look at that food in there. And here comes the alpha female, and she knows how to get to it. She knows exactly the sequence of moves to do it. While in the next group over, that alpha female is dazzling them by doing her version of doing the exact same thing. And here's how you do it. And of course, what you saw was everybody learned to do it. You saw a feature of cultural transmission in non-human primates, which made a whole lot of sense. Duvall picked the right female to teach this to, the alpha female, with cachet, with coolness, all of that. Every other chimp just wanting to grow up to be just like her. What you see in non-human primates in the wild is if a monkey, for example, famously Japanese macaque monkeys, happens to stumble into a new way of doing something. The famed example, Japanese macaques living by the ocean who discovered tourists come there, pilgrims come there and toss potatoes to the macaques, and they live on that, which has its own mixed blessings. But this one macaque monkey, this Japanese macaque named Emo discovered that when you picked up the potato, it was covered in sand. Throw it in the water. The potato would start to sink, the sand would stay on the surface, and quick grab the potato, and it was now desanded. And what you saw was other macaque monkeys started to learn it. And the critical thing in terms of cultural transmission, which anyone who in their youth listened to Elvis and outraged their elders with it, was Emo was a young female. No monkey older than Emo ever learned to do this. This cultural innovation spread throughout the young. And the way to do that, where it's spread instead amid virtually everyone, is get the alpha female, which is what was done. Okay, so soon everybody learned to work the puzzle box the same way as the alpha female did. That's terrific. A spread of a cultural tradition. And by all the rules of hard-assed anthropology, this is a case of cultural transmission. Lateral to similar age group and intergenerational. It got on to the youngins there. But then the really interesting thing happened, which was every now and then, one of the other chimps in the group going about trying to get to the food there would stumble into the alternative way of doing it and would master that. And it was just as easy. It wasn't anymore. It was just as good of a solution. They had stumbled into a way to be a nonconformist. Here's another way of doing this. And what was noted in every single example of this is this chimp would stumble into, here's a way for me to march to a different drummer. And after a couple of days, the chimp would stop doing it and go back to doing it like everybody else. So a pressure towards conformity, and whether opening the puzzle box a different way from everyone else would get you more likely to be predated out in the wild, who knows, but showing just how powerful and utterly arbitrary cultural tradition and stumble into another equally good, equally arbitrary way of doing the same thing. And after a couple of days, I don't know if this chimp was afraid of feeling like a total dork and being ostracized and nobody sitting at them at the lunch table, but they conformed. They went back to doing it the same way as everyone else. And this is real familiar primate behavior.
As another example of literal fashion trends in other species, so there's also the resurfacing trend, no pun intended, of orcas wearing dead salmon as hats, which I definitely recommend looking up. So there you go. Finally, Pontalis from Greece says, what benefits does playing provide for adults? Does it have to be enjoyable?
Okay, so how do you define play? I know it when I see it. How do you define it? I would define it in the context of stress psychology type people, which is, what is stress about? You lack control, you lack predictability, it's terribly stressful. What is play? I would say play is when you were in a sufficiently safe, benevolent setting that you're willing to give up control and give up predictability and say, surprise me. This is going to be fun. Like wondering if somebody is about to tickle you, you're whoever, and wonder they're going to do it. Part of that is you're giving up predictability, and that's totally great and that's benevolent. On the other hand, if you were being like Himmler was the one trying to tickle you, that would not feel as safe of a setting. Play is when you were willing to give up control and predictability to be surprised in a safe setting. So, most research about play, reasonably enough, has been with kids. There's a wonderful group called the National Institute for Play, which was founded by a psychiatrist named Stuart Brown, who's a really interesting, impressive guy, who's done all sorts of stuff on documenting how many bad adult outcomes you get in kids who never played. And probably even worse and more poignantly, kids who were never played with. And that looks really bad. And Stuart Brown has given this really like wonderfully insightful, really sad soundbite. The opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. Okay, so what is play about in kids? Because that's important when we contrast it with adult play. And what kid play is all about is preparation, practice for adult behaviors. Ethology, the science of animal behavior in natural settings, they have this concept fixed action patterns, little units of behavior, units that were instinctual, that were hardwired. And what you had to learn was the appropriate social context for that particular behavior. Laughing, lunging, wrestling, whatever, a whole bunch of fixed action patterns. And what you would typically see is when behavior is running in its conventional way, you'll have a sequence of fixed action patterns. You go through a whole sequence of behaviors having to do with mating, courtship, aggression, parenting, so on. And what kid play is about is you see individual fragments of fixed action patterns. Kids just playing at, for example, every species out there has some version of wrestling, of rough and tumble play with both male and female youngins. And what's that about? You see little bits and pieces of it. You will see young baboons practicing lunging at each other without necessarily following through, or practicing at knocking each other over wrestling. And once you got them down, then you're done. You're done practicing little bits and pieces to eventually string all this together. And you see the same thing just to get very stereotypical about sex differences extending beyond just humans. You will see higher rates of aggressive, rough and tumble play among males in most social species, not in ones that have sex reversal systems like spotted hyenas. You will see parenting type behavior play fragments of in young females at a higher rate than in young males. Okay, you know that drill. And the key thing is you're not going through the whole shebang of all the building blocks of that eventual behavior. You're going through the fun parts of it, the exciting parts, the interesting parts. You do not see little girls playing with dolls and pretending that it's really uncomfortable picking up your baby because you had an episiotomy last week. That is not commonplace. You don't play with your baby doll, and what you do is you act all anxious because you haven't signed them up for the waiting list for a preschool yet. It's only certain components of it. Okay, so the big question in the infant child play field, whether human or non-human, is how much of this is pure play preparative, how much of this is already a real version of the adult stuff. And where that plays out is young primates predominantly male, but not exclusively so, doing rough and tumble play? Are you just like figuring out how to knock somebody else over? And are you just figuring out how to give an aggressive display? And are you just figuring out how to give a subordination display? Or are you beginning to figure out you're going to be doing more subordination displays in your adult life than aggressive displays? Are you already getting practice about rank asymmetries that are coming in? And unfortunately, there's lots of reasons to think that young non-human primate rough and tumble play is not play in the abstract sense of pure practice for its own sake. You're already starting to see the asymmetries that will just get more and more dramatic as you move into adulthood. Okay, so that brings us to adult play. And adult play isn't preparative. Some of the time it's regressive in a good sort of way. It's nostalgic. It's playing shoots and ladders in your nursing home. I don't know what. Some of the time it's escapism. Escapism, like a lot of our less healthy adult habits. There was this great cartoon. Two kids are sitting there and they're both drinking out of juice boxes. And one of them is saying, I drink to forget. Adults drink to forget. Adults play to forget, to escape from stressors, things of that sort. That is certainly the case. And what adult play is often about is a way of stepping away from all your sources of lack of control and a malevolent setting, lack of predictability, malevolent setting, all of that. So, looking closer at adult play, the question becomes, is it always pleasurable? Is it always playful? Is it always, to use a different term, useless? Is it always for its own purpose? Is it always inherent? Is it always in and of itself? And that really is the characteristic of play. And you see exactly why it stops being play when you get, oh, I don't know, some stressed executive guy goes to his doctor and says, you need a hobby. You need a hobby. Why don't you take a painting? And 3 days later, the guy calls up the doctor and says, Doc, this is great. This painting, I've done 7 paintings already. No, that's not, it is not directional. It is not meant towards consummation of a goal. It's an end in and of itself. And that could be a challenge. As we were telling you, Rachel, earlier, mommy and I are now doing piano and flute duets in the evenings, and it's fantastic. And it's fantastic because it's got, among other things, an adult play challenge, which is the last time mommy was playing the flute on a regular basis 40 years ago, she was cutthroat competitions for first chair in an orchestra. And the last time I was playing piano seriously 40 years ago, I was trying to get accepted into master classes and was wishing terrible things to happen to the fingers of my competitors. And we're not going to be great at it anymore. And thus, this challenge of how do you do something for just its own sake? And we're kind of getting the hang of it. And it's fantastic. And that's what adult plays. It's not a chance to get better at something, and it's something as an end in and of itself. I saw a wonderful example of this. A man who was one of my sort of mentor inspirations, a cardiologist named Meyer Friedman. Everyone called him Mike Friedman. He was the person who, in the 1950s, first described type A personality and how it increased your risk of cardiovascular disease. And he was a wonderful guy and a father figure in lots of ways. And in his early 90s, he still had a research group and he was still into the research. And, I'd get together for lunch with him now and then. I would say, oh, so what's going on? What happened with that paper? And it would say, those son of a bitch reviewers, they didn't understand the main points. They thought we should be doing this other statistical test. They rejected the paper because they're idiots. They didn't understand. That's not the question we were asking. So to get it published, we got to go back now and spend the next 2 years redoing the statistics. And then he would pause, and at age 92, he would say, I'm not going to live long enough to see that, but yeah, we're going to show them. They had their heads up there. Yeah, we're going to. And what I realized, the totally great thing about him is traditionally there's this very tight coupling between appetite, appetitive behavior, and the goal of consumatory behavior, of it working out where you get to. And what was he doing? He was running on pure appetite. He was saying, yeah, this is going to be great because we can show them we were wrong and we were right. And, I'm probably not going to live long enough. And he didn't, in fact, in that particular case, but at a point in life where the pleasure is just still from having the appetite and it's not what it leads to. So I think that is what adult play is great for, where it's for its own sake. It's in and of itself, and just the joy of movement, the joy of creating, the joy of any of those things, totally absent of what's it going to pay off in the long run. So I think it's a wonderful thing, obviously.
And that is it for episode 52. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.